Hello, I'm Andrew Norman, AC Norman & Co. Concertinas. We make and repair concertinas, and we've been making and repairing since 1976. Recently we made a video showing Chinese-made concertinas and Italian-made concertinas. The Italian ones are better made and more expensive, but they're all considered beginners models, and they all have certain design faults which could be avoided. So the fact is, if you're buying one of these cheaper concertinas, especially if you're buying second hand like the ones we showed you, then you may have troubles, design faults and age related faults that perhaps happen sooner rather than later, with plastic bellows disintegrating, things like that. That if you look at the last video, then there's a lot more detail. This time we're going to show you some other concertinas that kind of fall into the gap between traditional concertinas, second-hand concertinas. All of these concertinas you could pick up for less than £1,000, possibly even half that if you're lucky. The first one we have here is Wheatstone Mayfair. Post World War II, Wheatstone came up with this idea that they could make a budget concertina, both Anglo and English, and use accordion reeds instead of the traditional reeds that took an awful lot of hand finishing. They didn't manage to compete with the accordion in economic terms because so many accordions were coming in from Italy, but what they did do was to come up with a very budget minded concertina. And it's a good sound. Has plastic buttons, rather basic ends, but nonetheless nice feel to it, nice size to it. An instrument like this is worth spending money on, can be picked up relatively cheaply, and is worth having it restored. Every part can come apart relatively easily and be restored to almost as new condition. This next one, although it looks like a later Stagi or Brunner Industries type Stagi, this is either an early Stagi or maybe one of the Bastaris that came before the Stagi. So the same finish on the ends, although the plating looks considerably better on this one, much earlier one. Got far more conventional looking bellows, and quite a good sound, although the springing is incredibly heavy on the buttons, which probably explains why so many of these instruments have survived well. They simply haven't been played. And finally we've got a relative newcomer. This is the Blackthorn, which has plastic buttons. All of these have plastic buttons. This has plastic buttons, wooden ends, and like the others, leather bellows. This is the Wheatstone Mayfair. Has plastic buttons, metal ends, and as you see, accordion reeds, but each of these accordion reeds is held on with a small nut at either end on a stud, and it's got leather valves in this particular model. Some of them have plastic valves, but it does mean that if you want to remove a reed to be able to change the valve or to tune it, a lengthy process unscrewing each of these nuts to take a single reed off, but nonetheless it is quite feasible and definitely worth doing, as the sound is quite good. Reasonable quality bellows, perhaps not as good as the traditional Wheatstone, the very highest quality, but nonetheless perfectly durable and satisfactory. This is the inside of the Wheatstone Mayfair. They're straight levers, straight wire. There's no bushings, but they generally work quite satisfactorily, and the springing is such that all the buttons are relatively light and easy to play, Can be a bit fussy, sometimes they get jammed, but anything like this can be fixed. You're not faced with disintegrating rubber or any other problems that we illustrated with the Chinese or Italian concertinas. And this is one we have in stock waiting for repairs. We'll completely redo the insides, new pads, make sure everything plays as it would have done possibly in the 1950s. This is the Stagi, or possibly Bastari. I don't know when exactly it was made. Not greatly different to the modern version, except if you look at the inside, they've mounted the reeds flat rather than on blocks. Here they put a block in because the bass reeds are longer and there wouldn't be room, but this will give a better sound. There's also just a bit more thought gone into the manufacture and a bit of a higher standard of work. It's only a very small air hole still, but again, if you need to get to replace any of the valves, see they're curling up and they'll need replacing, or if you need to tune any of the reeds, it's going to take time, but it's relatively straightforward to remove these screws, remove a reed, tune it and put it back. So in terms of future use, although this is one of the oldest of the Stagis, there's no reason at all why it can't be brought back into perfect condition again. This is the inside of the Stagi, much the same as the later ones. The design hasn't changed an awful lot. It's still the aluminium levers, the plastic buttons and a rubber or a synthetic rubber tubing. Now there are ways to improve that, and sometimes when they get worn the buttons can come out of position and they'll jam, but it is more or less possible to bring this back to good order. It's only when the levers get really worn that they might need replacing. This is the Blackthorn Concertina, which is relatively new. As you can see, they're individual levers with each of them has a fulcrum and a rivet there, so it should be a much better action, but as it happens the springing is still much heavier on the shorter levers than it is on the longer levers. So whilst it ought to be much better to play, it will be somewhat better than the cheaper Chinese instruments, but it's still not as good as it should be. And if you look at the back, they've mounted all the reeds flat, which will produce a better sound, but they've got this wax absolutely everywhere and there's evidence of mistakes during manufacture, but I suppose that's what happens when something is mass produced in China. Again, perfectly satisfactory design, but could have been done better. The bellows are leather and the inside, I would imagine that this plastic tape here is going to come adrift sooner rather than later. As we've already said, don't buy an instrument that has plastic in the bellows rather than leather, particularly for the gussets, because they will just disintegrate sooner rather than later. So to conclude, this is the Blackthorn, Chinese made, and it suffers with the same build quality and design faults that the cheaper ones have, so it could have been a lot better. The Italian made Stagi, probably better made than the new ones, and it still has the same faults that feature, that we'll show in the video that we've already done on the Italian and the cheaper Chinese models. However, pretty reasonable value for money, and it's entirely fixable. These, the older ones, the Wheatstone Mayfairs, there are more faults now as they've got older, but the build quality is considerably better and they are entirely fixable. they can be tuned, they can be every bit as good as they were new or even better. So without a doubt, go for a Mayfair, ignore the Chinese instruments, but if you want a cheaper one, then a Stagi is probably a fair bet. As I said in a previous video about the cheaper Chinese and Italian concertinas, don't rush out and buy a new concertina, especially not a second-hand concertina of that quality. You'll probably regret it, it'll probably put you off playing the concertina and you'll have just lost money. So try a load of concertinas first, borrow one if you can, come and see us, try a few concertinas, make the comparison, and you'll realise that in fact it doesn't pay to buy a cheap instrument because it's just money down the drain. You might as well buy a better instrument and it'll last a lifetime. So here's one of ours we made earlier, in fact 20 something years earlier.